Have any of you ever been in a narcissistic relationship with somebody where you know that probably the reason that they're narcissistic is because they were a spoiled brat as a child? Their parents gave them everything and anything. They never heard the word no. And now you can see why they're like this as an adult. And knowing that, how did that affect how you thought about them and their narcissism? Did it lead you to make excuses or say, oh gosh, I'm not going to be one more person who spoils you? Let's take that on. I'm Dr. Ramani, and welcome to this YouTube channel where we take on these kinds of questions about narcissism. In this particular series, we're looking at sort of some of the origins of narcissism, where the backstories of these patterns. But instead of just focusing on that, how you take your knowledge of what that backstory is, like, I see why they're narcissistic, this or that happened to them. How does that really affect the kinds of justifications you make for this relationship? So let's take this on. The tricky thing about narcissism is that there's no one clear path, that this is how it happens, and people aren't really born this way. But we do know that some people become narcissistic because in essence, really, they were just simply spoiled brats as kids. So if I can give you just one simple piece of evidence, really do not get into a relationship with someone who is a really spoiled child. Because even if they are not narcissistic as adults, it may not be worth the headache. Because in this essence, you're going to end up spending the rest of your life cleaning up after them. Now, some folks become narcissistic because they were spoiled. But not just spoiled. They were spoiled and their emotional needs were not met. So in essence, they were overindulged sort of with material things, toys, experiences. They didn't have to clean their room. They could buy everything in the gift store. The parent would let the kid do whatever they wanted. They just basically never heard no. But simultaneously, they'd be underindulged emotionally. They might get a sports car for their 16th birthday, but if they had a real emotional want or need or hurt, their parent would be completely disinterested, probably looking for a way to buy themselves out of the situation, or may even shame their child for having those emotions. Now, just spoiling a kid is not enough to make them narcissistic. If the parent is actually really present and mirroring and emotionally available and consistent, and also spoils the child, it's not a likely combination, but it's possible. It's definitely far less likely to see that spoiled child careening into narcissism. What is more likely is what we see as a combination of that difficult temperament, plus that being spoiled, plus having an inconsistent or unavailable caregiver. That all adds up to that overindulged, spoiled path to narcissism. Now, what does that mean in adulthood? It can be hard, for example, for people like this to hold jobs because the first time they're held accountable or they don't want to follow the rules, they may lose the job because they're so accustomed to getting their way and not having to follow rules. People with these spoiled backstories may be undisciplined with money because they're just so used to getting what they want when they want and assuming it'll always all work out. They may also maintain an ongoing financial dependence on their parents who spoiled them initially and are still available to just keep bailing them out and buying them what they want. Narcissistic people with the overindulged backstory, that spoiled backstory, may get really easily dysregulated when they're frustrated or disappointed because back in the day, they just always got what they wanted. Think of like Veruca Salt and Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Another thing to remember about people who have this sort of spoiled child, overindulged origin to their narcissism, another thing they often don't ever learn is how to soothe themselves. Because they always get their way, they never have to sit with disappointment. So they don't have to sit with that uncomfortable feeling and learn to do something with it. What that means is as they go into adulthood, they don't have what we call that internal self-soothing mechanism, a way to sort of calm themselves down when they get worked up. As a spoiled child, when they got worked up, either someone would buy them off or let them have their crazed tantrum. As adults, they don't have that internal mechanism to sort of soothe themselves. And so as an adult, you'll see them often get really bent out of shape and really escalate quickly when they don't get their way. So what does that mean for an adult relationship? It means living with the equivalent of a spoiled child who will always put their material needs ahead of everyone else's. Sorry, couldn't pay the bills this month, but look at this cool new skateboard I bought. This kind of spoiled person may expect you to keep spoiling them in adulthood and have a sort of stunted sense of irresponsibility. You may feel like you're constantly cleaning up after an insolent teenager. When we think of the impact of this kind of a origin story on you, I gotta tell you, this story doesn't typically bring up much empathy from adults in relationships with people like this. Now, it's one thing when we learn about someone's history of trauma or difficulties with attachment. Those stories are difficult to hear about, and people might fall into a justification loop if you hear someone had a tough start. But with these overindulged spoiled brat stories, lots of people may say, yikes, when I finally met their family, I got it. And so when they'll see they go home and they're waited on by enabling parents and they get away with everything. And you can say, now I see why they expect me to be their personal assistant, their house cleaner, their butler, and the adult in the relationship. And you may be less likely to feel so bad for them or to justify their behavior. Some folks may get too deep into the relationship to get out. They have children or marriage or they live together, and they have the harsh reckoning that this spoiled child narcissism is now spoiled adult narcissism. But people may be less likely to say, oh, I feel so bad that they were spoiled as kids, but rather would say, why didn't I see this sooner? And sometimes they'll feel some disgust at this whole dynamic of the spoiled child being a spoiled adult. There isn't much hope for change here. People with these backstories may not be mobilized to change, and perhaps the only catalyst for change is if things in their life really go south for them and they lose their jobs, money, and really can't create the life they want. But their entitlement means that they will feel owed that life and may simply just descend deeper and deeper into chronic rage at not getting their way. And you may less likely to justify their behavior if you know that it's simply them being a spoiled child, which is a lot of their origin of it. But knowing this backstory, if you can, it can be a real wake-up call that there's probably not much you can do to turn this relationship around. If you set boundaries, they'll push back. If you try to communicate, they won't listen. But with this as the story about why they're narcissistic, it might leave you feeling a little less guilty, which may mean you are more willing to walk away. The continuum of these backstories, some of which are really difficult, again, like things like trauma and neglect, but this one, where the spoiled child, often the golden child, gets away with so much, gets whatever they want, and turns into sort of a wretched adult. Like I said, typically grandiose narcissistic folks. But other than a handful of people say, well, it wasn't their fault, they were spoiled. Most people will say, it doesn't seem like you had such a hard childhood if you were being taken to Disneyland all the time and got every toy you wanted. And in this way, people who are with these spoiled child narcissists, if they can detect it early enough, may be less likely to justify and more likely to save themselves from having to clean up behind this narcissist for the rest of their lives. Thanks again.